The television courtroom had never witnessed such breathtaking audacity. Karen Pemberton, a 52-year-old self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, sat in Judge Judy's courtroom with a smirk that could curdle milk, her eyes fixed on the man sitting across from her with pure contempt. That man was James Sullivan, a 34-year-old former Army sergeant who had given his leg and nearly his life for his country in the mountains of Afghanistan. His Purple Heart was pinned proudly to his chest, and his prosthetic leg was visible beneath his neatly pressed khakis. But none of that mattered to Karen. In her mind, she was about to expose the fraud of the century, and she had no idea that the next 8 minutes would destroy her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The case seemed simple on the surface. A dispute over a handicapped parking space in the upscale Riverside Gardens community. But what unfolded in that courtroom would become the most viral moment in daytime television history, shared over 30 million times across every social media platform, sparking a national conversation about invisible disabilities, veterans' rights, and the toxic entitlement that had infected suburban America. Karen had walked into that courtroom believing she was a hero, a warrior for justice exposing a benefits cheat. She had spent 6 months surveilling James, documenting his every move, filing complaint after complaint with anyone who would listen. She had folders full of evidence, videos she had edited herself, and an unshakable conviction that she was right and everyone else was blind. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy's own father was a decorated World War II veteran who had struggled with invisible wounds for decades. What she didn't know was that Judge Judy had spent the previous evening on the phone with the Pentagon, reviewing classified military records that would expose Karen's crusade as not just misguided but monstrously cruel. What she didn't know was that her own secrets, her own hypocrisy, had been uncovered by a legal mind that had demolished liars and bullies for 25 years. The reckoning was coming, and it would be absolutely devastating. Before we dive into the complete destruction of the most hated Karen in America, make sure to hit that like button if you support our veterans and believe they deserve respect, not interrogation. Subscribe so you never miss these explosive courtroom moments that show what happens when entitled bullies target the wrong person. Trust me, what Judge Judy reveals about Karen's own disability fraud will leave you absolutely speechless, and watching this woman tremble uncontrollably as her life unravels is the justice our veterans deserve. James Sullivan had moved to Riverside Gardens 8 months earlier, hoping for a fresh start after his medical discharge from the Army. He had served 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne Division, earning a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and the eternal gratitude of 3 soldiers whose lives he had saved when he threw himself toward an improvised explosive device outside Kandahar. The explosion had destroyed his right leg below the knee, fractured his pelvis, and left him with traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD. His disability rating from the Department of Veterans Affairs was 80%, and he struggled daily with phantom limb pain, mobility issues, and psychological wounds that were far deeper than the physical scars covering his body. The handicapped parking space assigned to his unit was exactly 15 feet closer to the entrance than the regular spots. 15 feet that made the difference between manageable pain and agony when he returned from his therapy appointments at the VA hospital. 15 feet that Karen Pemberton decided were an insult to her view and an affront to her sense of order. She lived in a unit directly adjacent to the handicapped space, and from the moment James moved in, she had made it her personal mission to prove he was faking his disability. Her logic was simple and brutally ignorant. If someone could walk without a visible limp, if they could carry grocery bags, if they didn't look disabled enough for her arbitrary standards, then they were clearly taking advantage of the system and stealing from people who were really disabled. Karen's harassment campaign had started small. Notes left on James' windshield questioning whether he really needed the space. Pointed comments when she saw him in the parking lot about how good he looked, how strong he seemed, how lucky he was to be so mobile. But when James politely tried to explain his injuries and showed her his prosthetic leg, Karen had doubled down. She began calling the police, claiming he was illegally parked in a handicapped space. 8 times the police came. 8 times they verified his legitimate handicapped placard and left without incident. But Karen was undeterred. She organized a petition among the neighbors to investigate parking fraud, managing to get 12 signatures from people who didn't know James and believed Karen's lies about able-bodied people stealing spaces from the truly needy. Then Karen escalated to surveillance. She set up a camera pointed at James' parking space and began documenting every time he walked to his truck, every time he carried something, every time he moved in a way that didn't fit her narrow definition of disabled. She edited these videos to remove context, to make his careful, pain-managed movements look normal. She posted them on social media with captions like, "Watch this faker pretend to be disabled," and "Stolen valor and benefits fraud." She reported him to the Veterans Affairs Office, claiming he was fraudulently collecting disability payments. The VA investigated and cleared him completely, but the process triggered a severe PTSD episode that landed James in the psychiatric ward for 3 days, suicidal and broken. The final straw came when Karen approached James' 8-year-old daughter in the parking lot and told her that her daddy was a liar who was pretending to be hurt for special treatment. The little girl came home sobbing, asking her father why the mean lady said he was faking. James Sullivan, a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, broke down completely. His therapist documented that Karen's harassment was directly responsible for his mental health crisis, and James made the hardest decision of his life. He would sue Karen Pemberton for $25,000 in damages for emotional distress, property damage from the keying and spray painting of his truck and garage, and the medical costs from his hospitalization. Karen, true to form, countersued for $50,000, claiming James was defaming her reputation and causing her emotional distress by calling her a bully. Karen Pemberton had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and in her delusional mind, this was going to be her finest hour. She had practiced her presentation in front of the mirror dozens of times, refining her arguments and perfecting her expressions of righteous indignation. She had printed out hundreds of pages of evidence, organized them in color-coded folders, and even created a PowerPoint presentation that the producers politely told her wouldn't be necessary. She had posted on her Facebook page that she was appearing on Judge Judy to expose a benefits cheat, receiving dozens of supportive comments from her echo chamber of similarly entitled neighbors who believed the world owed them explanations for everyone else's circumstances. She had even picked out her outfit carefully, choosing a conservative navy suit with an American flag pin on the lapel, the ultimate symbol of patriotic authority that she believed gave her the moral high ground. What made Karen particularly dangerous wasn't just her ignorance about disability, though that was profound. It was her absolute certainty that she was right. She had spent 14 years as the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog of Riverside Gardens, building a reputation as someone who maintained standards and enforced rules. In her mind, she wasn't a bully. She was a guardian of community values, a warrior against the lazy and fraudulent people who tried to take advantage of systems designed for the truly deserving. The fact that she had driven multiple families from the neighborhood with her harassment, that she had reduced grown adults to tears with her relentless complaints, that she had weaponized every rule and regulation against anyone who dared question her authority, none of that registered as problematic behavior in her twisted worldview. She saw herself as the hero of every story, the one person brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths that everyone else was too politically correct to acknowledge. Her pattern of targeting vulnerable people was well established in the community, though most neighbors were too afraid of becoming her next victim to speak up. 3 years earlier, she had harassed a single mother over children's toys left in the front yard, filing so many complaints that the woman eventually sold her home at a loss just to escape. 2 years ago, she had targeted an elderly man whose walker made clicking sounds on the sidewalk, claiming the noise violated community quiet hours and demanding he either get a silent walker or move. Last year, she had made life miserable for an immigrant family whose cooking smells she found offensive, reporting them to the HOA for air quality violations until they stopped using their own kitchen. The pattern was always the same. Karen would identify someone she perceived as different or vulnerable, find some rule or regulation she could weaponize, and then launch a campaign of harassment disguised as community protection until her victim either complied completely or fled entirely. When James Sullivan moved into Riverside Gardens, Karen had immediately identified him as her next project. The handicapped parking space that came with his unit was 15 feet from her living room window, and she had convinced herself that his truck's presence in that space somehow diminished her property value and obstructed her view. The fact that the space had always been designated for handicapped parking didn't matter. The fact that James had every legal right to use it didn't register. In Karen's mind, the space should remain empty because she preferred looking at empty asphalt rather than someone's vehicle, and anyone who actually needed to use it was by definition suspect and deserving of investigation. Her harassment of James had been methodical and escalating. The first month, she left 23 handwritten notes on his windshield, each one questioning his need for the space with increasing hostility. When he tried to explain his injuries, she dismissed him with a wave of her hand, telling him that plenty of people had problems and they didn't expect special treatment. The second month, she began calling the police every time she saw his truck, claiming it was illegally parked. The officers who responded grew increasingly frustrated with her false reports, but Karen interpreted their dismissals as evidence of a system that was too lazy or corrupt to investigate real fraud. By the third month, she had organized her petition, framing James as a symbol of everything wrong with entitlement culture, conveniently ignoring the irony of her own entitlement in believing she had the right to police her neighbor's medical conditions. The fourth month marked her descent into true stalker territory. She purchased a camera and set it up pointing directly at James' parking space, recording his every movement. She would watch for hours, waiting for moments when he walked without a visible limp, when he carried grocery bags, when he did anything that didn't match her cartoon understanding of disability. She became obsessed, spending her days editing footage and her nights posting it to social media groups dedicated to exposing fraud. She created accounts on multiple platforms specifically to share her videos, always framing herself as a concerned citizen protecting taxpayer dollars from theft. The comments she received from strangers online only reinforced her conviction that she was performing a public service, even as her own neighbors began avoiding her and whispering about her increasingly unhinged behavior. By the fifth month, Karen had escalated to reporting James to the Veterans Affairs Office, filing a formal complaint alleging benefits fraud. She had no understanding of how VA disability worked, no knowledge of the rigorous medical examinations and documentation required, no comprehension of the difference between total immobility and qualifying disability. In her mind, if someone could walk and carry things, they weren't disabled, and any suggestion otherwise was political correctness gone mad. When the VA investigated and cleared James, Karen didn't accept that she might be wrong. Instead, she convinced herself that the system was broken and that James had somehow manipulated his way through the investigation. The fact that her false report had triggered a severe PTSD episode that hospitalized James didn't give her a moment's pause. If anything, she saw his mental health crisis as further evidence that he was unstable and undeserving of accommodation. The sixth month brought Karen's most despicable act. She had watched James' daughter playing in the parking lot and made the calculated decision to approach the child. She told that 8-year-old girl that her father was a liar and a faker, that he was pretending to be hurt to get special treatment, and that good people don't lie for personal gain. The little girl's tears, her confusion, her desperate questions to her father about why the mean lady said he was bad, none of that registered as cruelty in Karen's mind. She actually believed she was teaching the child an important lesson about honesty and integrity, completely blind to the fact that she was traumatizing an innocent child whose father had sacrificed everything for his country. When James filed his lawsuit, Karen's response was immediate and predictable. She countersued for twice the amount, claiming that he was defaming her character and damaging her reputation in the community. She genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation, that this ungrateful veteran was attacking her for having the courage to question his obviously fraudulent disability claim. The morning of the taping, Karen Pemberton arrived at the studio 2 hours early, her 3 overstuffed folders clutched against her chest like shields of righteousness. She had dressed in her carefully selected navy suit, the American flag pinned positioned prominently on her lapel, a choice that would later be described by millions of social media users as obscenely ironic given what she was about to do to an actual American hero. She spent those 2 hours in the waiting area rehearsing her opening statement, occasionally glancing at James Sullivan with undisguised contempt. James sat quietly in his wheelchair, his cane resting against the armrest, his purple heart visible on his chest, his eyes downcast as he tried to manage the anxiety that always accompanied being in crowded, unpredictable environments. His service dog, a German shepherd named Riley trained to detect and interrupt PTSD episodes, sat alertly by his side. Karen had actually complained to production staff that the dog shouldn't be allowed in the courtroom, claiming it was a distraction and probably fake just like James' disability. When the bailiff finally called them into the courtroom, Karen strutted through those doors like a conquering general entering occupied territory. Her confidence was astronomical, her sense of moral superiority radiating from every pore. She had played out this scenario in her mind hundreds of times, and in every version, Judge Judy thanked her for her diligence in exposing fraud and ruled in her favor, perhaps even recommending criminal charges against James. She positioned herself at the defendant's podium with the posture of someone who believed they were about to deliver a TED Talk that would change the world. She made direct eye contact with the cameras, already imagining herself going viral for all the right reasons, becoming the face of common sense fighting back against political correctness and fraudulent disability claims. Judge Judy entered with her characteristic brisk efficiency, her robes flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. Her face was professionally neutral, but those who had watched her show for years would have recognized the slight tension around her eyes, the particular set of her jaw that indicated she was already several moves ahead in a chess game the participants didn't even know they were playing. She had spent the previous evening reviewing every document in this case with the meticulous attention of someone who took veterans' issues personally. Her own father's struggles with invisible wounds from World War II had shaped her entire worldview on disability and service, and she had recognized within the first paragraph of Karen's complaint that she was dealing with a particularly toxic combination of ignorance and malice. Judge Judy opened the case with her signature directness, her voice cutting through the courtroom with surgical precision. Ms. Pemberton, you're suing Mr. Sullivan for defamation, claiming he has damaged your reputation by calling you a bully and filing this lawsuit against you. You're seeking $50,000 in damages. But Mr. Sullivan is countersuing you for $25,000, claiming harassment, emotional distress, and property damage. Let's start with you, Ms. Pemberton. Tell me why you believe Mr. Sullivan is defaming you. It was a simple, straightforward question, the kind Judge Judy had asked thousands of times in her decades on the bench. But Karen's response would immediately signal that this case was going to be anything but ordinary, and that her arrogance was about to write checks her credibility couldn't possibly cash. Karen launched into her prepared speech with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting months for this platform. Your Honor, I am here today to expose a fraud that has been perpetrated against the taxpayers of this country and the truly disabled veterans who deserve our support. Mr. Sullivan has been illegally occupying a handicapped parking space in our community while showing clear evidence that he is not actually disabled. She paused dramatically, as if expecting applause, before continuing. I have spent 6 months documenting his activities, and I have irrefutable proof that he walks normally, carries heavy objects, and engages in physical activities that would be impossible for someone who is genuinely disabled. She gestured to her folders with theatrical flair. I have videos, photographs, and testimony from neighbors who have all observed the same thing. This man is taking advantage of a system designed to help heroes, and someone needs to have the courage to say so. The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. Audible gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by angry murmurs that the bailiff had to quiet with a stern look. Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly, the first warning sign that experienced viewers recognized as the calm before a devastating storm. Ms. Pemberton, she said, her tone still professional but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass, let me make sure I understand your position. You believe that you are qualified to determine whether Mr. Sullivan's military disability rating is legitimate? Karen, completely missing the danger in that question, responded with confidence bordering on glee. Your Honor, I'm not questioning his military service. I'm sure he served, and I respect that. But serving doesn't give someone a free pass to lie about their current physical condition. I have eyes. I can see that he walks fine, carries things, lives a normal life. Real disabled people are in wheelchairs all the time or use crutches constantly. This man only uses his cane sometimes, and I've caught him on video walking without any assistive device at all. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone of dangerous curiosity. So in your medical opinion, Ms. Pemberton, what qualifies someone as disabled? Karen's response revealed the staggering depth of her ignorance. Well, they should look disabled, Your Honor. You know what I mean. If someone can walk and carry groceries and drive a car, they're not really disabled. They're taking a spot that could go to someone who actually needs it. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I see. And what are your medical qualifications that allow you to make these determinations? Karen actually laughed, a sound that would later be described by millions of viewers as the most tone-deaf thing they had ever heard. Your Honor, you don't need medical training to see the obvious. Common sense tells you when someone is faking. I've seen real disabled people, and they don't act like him. The courtroom had gone completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that precedes something catastrophic. Judge Judy let that silence hang for several long seconds, allowing Karen's words to fully register with everyone present. Then she turned her attention to James Sullivan, who was sitting hunched in his wheelchair, his service dog pressing against his leg in response to his rising anxiety. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice notably gentler, I'd like to hear your account of what happened. James looked up, his eyes meeting Judge Judy's, and took a deep breath before speaking. Your Honor, I moved to Riverside Gardens 8 months ago after my medical discharge from the Army. I served 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. On July 23, 2023, my unit was on patrol outside Kandahar when we encountered an IED. I saw the device and pushed my sergeant out of the way. The explosion took my leg below the knee and gave me a traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD. His voice was steady but strained, each word clearly costing him emotional energy. I have an 80% disability rating from the VA. I use a prosthetic leg that causes me constant pain, especially after extended walking. Some days I can manage without my cane for short distances, and some days I need my wheelchair. I have PTSD that makes crowds and unexpected situations difficult, which is why I have Riley, my service dog. The handicapped space assigned to my unit is 15 feet closer to the entrance, and those 15 feet make the difference between manageable pain and agony when I return from my therapy appointments. Judge Judy listened to James' testimony with visible empathy, her expression softening in a way that regular viewers rarely saw. She asked him several follow-up questions about his service, his injuries, and his daily struggles, each answer painting a picture of a man who had sacrificed everything for his country and was now simply trying to live a quiet life with his daughter. Then she turned her attention back to Karen Pemberton, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 20 degrees. Ms. Pemberton, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her judicial authority, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. You have spent the last several minutes telling me that you can visually diagnose disability, that you understand medical conditions better than VA doctors, and that you have the right to surveil and harass your neighbor because you don't believe he looks disabled enough for your personal standards. Is that an accurate summary of your position? Karen, still oblivious to the trap closing around her, nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Your Honor, exactly. Someone needs to stand up for what's right. Judge Judy's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Interesting. Very interesting. Because I spent last evening doing some research of my own, Ms. Pemberton, and I discovered some fascinating information that I think is very relevant to this case. She opened a folder on her bench, and Karen's confident expression flickered for the first time, a shadow of uncertainty crossing her face. You see, you've positioned yourself as an expert on disability fraud, as someone who can identify fake disabilities through observation. So I had my team pull your own disability records, and I have to say, what I found is absolutely illuminating. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, and Karen's face went from smug confidence to pale alarm in the span of 3 seconds. Judge Judy continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel through flesh. According to Social Security Administration records, you, Karen Pemberton, have been collecting disability payments since 2018 for a claimed back injury. You receive $1,847 per month in disability benefits, money that comes from the same taxpayer pool you're so concerned about protecting. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound emerging. That's different, she finally managed to stammer. My injury is real. I have chronic back pain that limits my activities. Judge Judy's response was swift and merciless. Oh, it's real. Tell me, Ms. Pemberton, does your chronic back pain prevent you from setting up surveillance cameras? Does it prevent you from standing outside for hours waiting to film your neighbor? Does it prevent you from spray painting garage doors and keying vehicles? The hypocrisy was now fully exposed, hanging in the air like toxic gas. Judge Judy reached for another document, and Karen visibly shrank in her chair. I have here your medical records, which I obtained with proper legal authority given the nature of your claims in this case. Your own doctor noted in multiple appointments that you exhibit no objective signs of disability and recommended you return to work. You appealed your disability denial 3 times before finally receiving benefits, and during that appeals process, you claimed you couldn't sit for more than 20 minutes, couldn't stand for more than 15 minutes, and couldn't lift more than 5 pounds. Yet according to your own social media posts, which are public record, you've been quite active. She began reading from printouts, her voice dripping with sarcasm. March 15th, hiked Sunset Trail, 6.2 miles, feeling great. April 3rd, spring cleaning day, reorganized my entire garage. May 10th, carried all my groceries in one trip because I'm efficient like that. Karen's hands were now visibly shaking, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Those are taken out of context, she protested weakly. I have good days and bad days. Judge Judy pounced on that statement like a hawk on a mouse. Good days and bad days. Excellent point, Ms. Pemberton. Because that's exactly how disability works for most people. Some days are better than others. Some days someone with a prosthetic leg might be able to walk short distances without a cane. Some days the pain is manageable. Some days a PTSD sufferer can handle crowds. But according to your own logic, if someone has a good day and functions normally, they must be faking their disability. So by your own standard, you must be faking yours. The logic trap was complete and inescapable, and Karen knew it. Her face had gone from pale to ashen, and her trembling had intensified to the point where she had to grip the podium to stay upright. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started, and what came next would be the most personally devastating moment of Karen's life. Ms. Pemberton, I want to tell you something personal, something I don't often share on this show. Judge Judy's voice took on a tone that was simultaneously softer and more intense, carrying the weight of deep emotion controlled by iron discipline. My father, Murray Blum, was a World War II veteran. He served his country with honor and came home with wounds that nobody could see. What we now call PTSD was called shell shock back then, and there was no treatment, no understanding, no accommodation for the men who had seen and experienced horrors that would break most people. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent, every person hanging on Judge Judy's words. My father struggled every single day of his life with anxiety, with nightmares, with depression that made simple tasks feel impossible. And people like you, Ms. Pemberton, people who thought they could judge whether someone was disabled enough, people who believed that invisible wounds weren't real wounds, those people made his life a living hell. They questioned why he couldn't hold a job. They whispered that he was weak or lazy. They suggested he was milking his service for sympathy. And every single one of those judgments was a knife in his heart, a denial of the sacrifice he had made for ungrateful people who had never faced a day of real hardship in their comfortable suburban lives. Karen was now openly crying, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. Judge Judy's words were hitting her like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of her self-righteousness until there was nothing left but the ugly truth of what she had done. Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes boring into Karen with an intensity that made the woman physically recoil. Mr. Sullivan is a hero, Ms. Pemberton. He threw himself toward an explosive device to save his brothers in arms. He sacrificed his leg, his peace of mind, and his quality of life so that you could sleep safely in your comfortable home and worry about parking spaces. And your response to his sacrifice was to spend 6 months trying to prove he was a liar. You filmed him. You stalked him. You filed false reports. You vandalized his property. And worst of all, you traumatized his 8-year-old daughter by telling her that her father was a fraud. The trembling that had started in Karen's hands had now spread throughout her entire body. She was shaking so violently that the bailiff moved closer, concerned she might collapse. But Judge Judy was relentless, her righteous anger on behalf of veterans everywhere fueling her systematic destruction of Karen's defense. You stood there and told me you can see who's really disabled and who's faking. You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner of your neighbor's medical condition. You decided that your visual assessment was more valid than military medical boards, VA doctors, and federal disability determinations. And all the while, you were collecting disability payments yourself for a condition your own doctor questioned. Judge Judy paused, letting the full weight of Karen's hypocrisy sink into every corner of the courtroom. The silence was profound, broken only by Karen's ragged breathing and the barely audible whimper that escaped her lips. Then Judge Judy delivered the words that would seal Karen's fate and become one of the most quoted moments in courtroom television history. Ms. Pemberton, you are not a hero protecting your community from fraud. You are a bully who weaponized your own ignorance against a man who gave everything for this country. You are a hypocrite who judges others by standards you yourself cannot meet. And you are about to learn that actions have consequences, even for people who believe their self-righteousness puts them above accountability. Judge Judy began her ruling with methodical precision, each point landing on Karen like a hammer blow. First, your defamation countersuit is dismissed with prejudice. You cannot be defamed by the truth, Ms. Pemberton, and the truth is that you are exactly what Mr. Sullivan called you, a bully and a harasser. Second, you will pay Mr. Sullivan $25,000 in damages. This covers his property damage, his medical expenses from the hospitalization you caused, and compensation for the emotional distress you inflicted on him and his young daughter. Karen's sobbing intensified, her body shaking so violently now that she had to grip the podium with both hands to remain standing. But Judge Judy was far from finished with her judgment. Third, Judge Judy continued, her voice carrying the full authority of decades of judicial experience. You will issue a written apology to Mr. Sullivan, to be read at the next Riverside Gardens community meeting and posted in the community newsletter. This apology will acknowledge your harassment, your false accusations, and the pain you caused a decorated veteran and his family. Fourth, you will complete 200 hours of community service at the VA hospital, where you will be required to assist actual disabled veterans and perhaps learn something about the sacrifices they have made and the challenges they face. The irony of forcing Karen to serve the very population she had so thoroughly disrespected was not lost on anyone in the courtroom, and several audience members nodded in approval at the poetic justice. But Judge Judy saved her most devastating blow for last, and when she delivered it, Karen's trembling reached a crescendo that looked almost like a seizure. Fifth, and most importantly, I am forwarding a complete copy of this case file, including all evidence presented here today, to the Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General. Your own disability claim will now be subject to the same scrutiny you applied to Mr. Sullivan's. If you can spend 6 months conducting surveillance, setting up cameras, vandalizing property, and stalking your neighbor, then clearly your back injury does not prevent you from substantial gainful activity. I strongly suspect that within 90 days, you will receive notice that your disability benefits are being terminated pending investigation, and you may very well face charges for disability fraud yourself. The color drained completely from Karen's face, and for a moment it seemed she might actually faint. The realization that she had not only lost the case but potentially destroyed her own financial stability and opened herself to criminal prosecution was too much for her fragile ego to process. Everything she had built, her reputation as a community watchdog, her sense of moral superiority, her disability income, all of it was crumbling in real time on national television. Judge Judy was not done. Sixth, I am also forwarding this case to the District Attorney's Office. You have admitted under oath to filing false police reports, which is a crime. You have admitted to vandalism and property destruction, which are crimes. And your harassment of Mr. Sullivan rises to the level of stalking in this jurisdiction, which is also a crime. Whether the district attorney chooses to prosecute is up to them, but I can assure you that this case file makes for very compelling evidence of criminal behavior. Karen had collapsed into her chair, unable to stand any longer, her sobs now loud enough to be clearly heard throughout the courtroom. The woman who had strutted in with such confidence, who had been so certain of her rightness and her victory, was now a broken, trembling mess who could barely breathe through her tears. Judge Judy's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy for Karen but with satisfaction that justice was being properly served. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Judy said, turning to address the veteran directly, I want you to know that this court recognizes your sacrifice and honors your service. You did nothing wrong. You owe no one an explanation for your disabilities, and you certainly don't owe anyone a performance of suffering to prove that your wounds are real. I hope this judgment brings you some measure of peace and allows you to move forward without the harassment you have endured. James Sullivan, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire proceeding, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to live in peace with my daughter. I never asked for special treatment, just the accommodations I'm legally entitled to. Judge Judy nodded, her face showing rare warmth. You deserve far more than peace, Mr. Sullivan. You deserve gratitude, respect, and a community that honors rather than questions your sacrifice. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Audience members rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes, giving James Sullivan a standing ovation that lasted over a minute. Karen remained slumped in her chair, still trembling, still sobbing, unable to process the magnitude of her public destruction. The bailiff had to help Karen from the courtroom because her shaking legs wouldn't support her weight. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her face, and her carefully selected outfit looked ridiculous now, the American flag pin a mockery of everything she had just done to an actual American hero. As she stumbled through the courtroom doors, cameras captured every moment of her humiliation, footage that would be shared millions of times within hours. James Sullivan wheeled himself out with dignity, his service dog Riley walking beside him, his head held high for the first time in months. His 8-year-old daughter, who had been waiting outside, ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, and the image of that embrace became the emotional centerpiece of every news story about the case. Within 2 hours of the episode airing, the clip had exploded across social media. The hashtag Justice for Veterans trended worldwide, with millions of active duty military veterans and their families sharing their own experiences with disability discrimination. Veterans organizations from the VFW to the Wounded Warrior Project shared the video with statements supporting Judge Judy's ruling and calling for greater awareness about invisible disabilities. The video reached 15 million views in the first 24 hours, 30 million by the end of the week, and eventually became the most watched courtroom clip in television history with over 50 million views across all platforms. The real-world consequences for Karen Pemberton were swift and devastating. Within 48 hours, the Riverside Gardens HOA held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her from any position of authority in the community. Her neighbors, many of whom had been too afraid to speak up during her reign of terror, came forward with their own stories of her harassment and bullying. 12 families she had driven from the neighborhood began discussing a class action lawsuit. Her social circle evaporated overnight as friends and acquaintances rushed to distance themselves from the most hated woman in America. Her social media accounts were flooded with thousands of comments, forcing her to delete them entirely. Local news stations camped outside her home, and she became a prisoner in her own house, the same house where she had spent months watching and judging James Sullivan. True to Judge Judy's prediction, Karen received a letter from the Social Security Administration exactly 73 days after the episode aired. Her disability benefits were suspended pending a full investigation into whether her activities constituted substantial gainful activity that would disqualify her from receiving payments. The investigation ultimately determined that she had been fraudulently collecting benefits while fully capable of working, and she was ordered to repay $47,000 in benefits received since 2018. Criminal charges for disability fraud were filed, and Karen eventually accepted a plea deal that included 2 years of probation, full restitution, and a permanent ban from receiving any federal benefits in the future. The district attorney also filed charges for filing false police reports and vandalism. Karen pleaded guilty to avoid trial and received an additional year of probation and a $5,000 fine. Her criminal record meant she could no longer work in any position requiring background checks, and combined with her toxic reputation, she found herself virtually unemployable in her community. She was forced to sell her home and move 3 states away, where she now lives quietly, a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging others and the inevitable consequences of bullying behavior. Meanwhile, James Sullivan's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The outpouring of support from across the country was overwhelming. A GoFundMe campaign started by veterans organizations raised over $175,000 for his daughter's education fund and his ongoing medical expenses. The VA hospital where he received treatment offered him a position as a peer counselor, helping other veterans navigate their own struggles with PTSD and physical disabilities. His community, ashamed of how one person's hatred had been allowed to flourish, came together to support him, organizing neighborhood events and creating a genuine welcoming environment for his family. Most importantly, his 8-year-old daughter received counseling funded by community donations, and she slowly recovered from the trauma Karen had inflicted. She wrote Judge Judy a letter thanking her for helping her daddy, a letter that Judge Judy read on air in a follow-up segment that generated another wave of emotional responses from viewers. This case became more than just a viral moment. It sparked a national conversation about invisible disabilities, about the sacrifices veterans make, and about the toxic culture of entitlement that allows people like Karen to terrorize their neighbors without consequence. Judge Judy's passionate defense of James Sullivan reminded millions of Americans that disability doesn't require a performance, that service members deserve respect not interrogation, and that real justice sometimes means holding bullies accountable for the pain they cause. Smash that subscribe button to never miss moments where justice prevails and entitled bullies learn that our veterans deserve nothing but respect and gratitude. Share this with someone who needs to see that accountability is real and that standing up to bullies can change lives. Comment below with your own veteran stories or experiences with disability discrimination, because every story shared helps build a more understanding and compassionate society. Remember, in Judge Judy's courtroom and in life, respect for those who served is not negotiable, and neither are the consequences for those who forget that fundamental truth. Our veterans gave everything for our freedom, and the very least they deserve is to live in peace without judgment from people who have never known real sacrifice.